Yes, welcome back to Karim Talks About Economics, which is this new podcast that I have started and that I hope that people will like, and they will tune in and they will listen to me read a little bit, talk a little bit about what's happening and what's not happening. Yesterday was the first episode. I discussed a little bit what this was going to be about and what the intention was. I also discussed how it was going to be. So 3 things that make this podcast worth your time is that it is spontaneous, in the sense that it's not something that I've really prepared, but something that flows out, so it's more natural. The second thing is that it is going to be informative. If you cannot use what I say, then you will be able to use the things that I read out loud, at least. And thirdly, it's going to be open-minded, which means that I am willing to share my thoughts, I'm willing to share your thoughts, and I'm willing to ask some deep questions that may not previously have been considered, as I do not have a specific agenda at mind. And of course also fuels back to the spontaneity of this podcast. Now, the agenda, I'm going to read that out loud. It consists of 5 sections, and I'm just going to read them out without describing them, as I did that yesterday. So firstly, there's going to be a little bit of a news section. We talk about, well, what's happening around the world. Especially in these crazy times, it makes sense to do that. And we have a follow-up from last time, which makes sense this time. We have a small reading section, then some new thoughts, summarizing what we've learned and what we have discussed, and at the end we're going to have a Q&A. Now, the Q&A at this point is not really an active part of the stream or of the podcast, and it is not so because I have not really published this podcast to anyone. But at some point it will be. Let's see the consistency first. And at that time I will be sharing it. So for the first point, the news, well, what's happening at the moment is still Corona. Corona is still happening. We're at 10,600,000 cases now. Now, of course, half of them are not active anymore. And we have around 560,000 deaths, something like that. Now, of course, a fifth of those, or a little over a fifth, have occurred in the US, which is quite devastating. The US also has a quarter of the cases, if not a little bit more, which is also devastating. Now, they also have the largest testing, which makes sense because they have all the big pharmaceuticals over there. But they should probably be doing more testing. And Dr. Fauci has announced that he would not be surprised if the per day cases increased and became 100,000. So at the moment, yesterday and the day before yesterday and the day before that, they were 40 plus, 43, 46, 43 again, which is of course a lot. Now, what can they do about that? Well, they really don't want to close down the economy again, because they have seen how difficult that is. And of course, also with the stock market now recovered, I think it's totally recovered, actually. It's a really big question whether you can risk closing down again, or you can just, if you risk to close it down again, and then the economy will break down. But if that happens, then of course people will lose trust. And we also have an election this year in November, which also fuels the actions, or at least it directly impacts us, not indirectly, because it directly impacts the actions of the politicians, especially Donald Trump, who is sitting in the Oval Office at this point, in the White House. Beside that, today marked the passing of the bill in China, um, or the security bill in Hong Kong. It's also called, which means that the Chinese authority, the police, I think, can move into Hong Kong, and also some other laws um, that are placed on the Hong Kongian people. They cannot criticize the Chinese government, which is, of course, for them a big deal because that's a part of their personality for so long. The world is not really outraged about this because it has been predicted, and Secretary of, I think it is Secretary of State Pompeo, went out and said, and that was few months ago, that you can actually not consider Hong Kong as an independent governed section of China anymore. It is de facto governed by China now. Denmark has opened up to a lot of countries at this point, which I personally think is maybe too soon, but I don't know. There's a lot of people, at least traveling. It was said that there was a lot of there was a jam in the direction going to Germany, and also some laws have been not halted but have been removed actually for tourists coming into Denmark. So the Norwegian people don't have to prove that they will actually stay a couple of nights in Denmark. Now they can just come and go as they please, as they would have prior to the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Now, follow up from last time, I remember I wrote down a question here, which is, does it matter whether money is controlled by gold or the forex market? That was the discussion about the golden standard, right? We discovered that the gold produces some problems for the central bank because, yeah, I'm just going to try to, I have to be spontaneous, so let me just explain it spontaneously. So the central bank, or all the banks, can not print out, but they can produce certificates that they have the gold, but as they produce more than they need to be gold, it needs to be gold backed. This means that they would ask the central bank for more gold. The central bank would produce more gold, send it out, but the banks would use it more, so they would demand more, and therefore the demand for gold would increase more and more per year, which the central bank had not expected. They thought that we could have a certain amount of gold in the society and that would be it. That didn't apparently work, and you could also see that some would cut off a part of the gold and then melt it back and sell it back to the central bank with a profit, which is of course some crazy things, some crazy business, right? And then the question was, well, does it make sense then to have gold as something in the middle between money and commodity market? Because we are only using money as a not, it's not a resource. Well, it is, right? But it's more of a tool to buy commodities, to exchange commodities in the commodity market. We had the example of milk, wheat, milk, wheat, and something, and a third thing yesterday. Let's just have these two, for instance, and goat. I think, and then the idea was, or the idea that we developed together was, well, currently we've removed the gold from being the catalyst as sorts in the middle, right? But we just have the money part, so there's a direct link, but that's not really true, because how is money then controlled, right? Can you just print out infinitely? Well, no, you can, because the money loses its value, but where is this value actually, I'd like to say discussed, but it's more set. But yeah, the market partners discuss it. One could argue by buying and selling, and that happens in the forex market. So does it matter? Well, we also reach the conclusion, not the conclusion, but the idea that if we let gold be in the middle instead of the forex market, for instance, while keep in mind that gold is also a commodity that can be sold, bought and sold, and that can be, for instance, for jewelry and something. So there's always something lost in the commodity of gold itself. We said that gold is a natural product that has a finite amount, and therefore it's not really individuals that control it, but rather nature, right? And then we had that the forex market was more controlled of individuals. As I said, it's trading. So is it better to have nature control it or humans? I went out for a run today, and I thought about this, and and the conclusion that I've reached is that I really don't think it matters. And it doesn't matter. Now, I have not read scientific articles about this, but I don't think it really matters, because well, with gold you're just taking an extra step, I think. But let me explain. So I have a commodity market with that productivity and the development of products. Products get cheaper. You're willing to exchange it for less gold. Now, that has to be translated into gold, into the gold price, and then the money price has to be translated into the gold, right? Because you also have banknotes, as we saw in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. But gold is not very versatile. It's not. Why do you want to keep in mind what is the price of the currency and the price of gold when you buy a commodity? Why not just keep in mind the price of the currency? Now, that's fine. It makes the entire process easier, maybe to understand, and faster. But now with the forex, you have a different problem, which is that now you're actually kind of comparing it to other nations, right? And the problem that we had, I think, previously, was that there was a lot of currencies that had a fixed exchange rate to the dollar, right? Then those countries treated the dollar as it was gold. Now, of course, the dollar itself fluctuated. So that's a huge problem. If the dollar loses value, well, then the currency of that country increases in value. but you're running a fixed exchange rate, so you would increase the value of your own currency, but not say then that the dollar increased, well, the fixed exchange rate, right? You would then have to remove money from it, but that's pretty difficult. And that's the thing. That's the argument, that it's better to have these floating exchange rates than the fixed exchange rate, such that it's actually the market, and that it is a kind of a democracy what happens with the currency, with the country's currency, rather than it being, well, a central bank that controls it and has to run a fixed rate, which might be quite difficult. And also might produce some mismatches in the market more than the floating would, because the floating, one would think that if there's no systematic error in that country, and usually it's the poor countries that have these fixed exchange rates, and where the central bank might not be that good, it would mean that this thing would continue forever, right? Because they would be stubborn and they would just print and print and print, for instance. And that's also what we saw, and I know that from personal experience, because that's what happened in Egypt, for instance, right? You had a central bank that was wrong in the currency, in the value of the Egyptian pound, and what you saw in 2018, I think, what you saw in 2018 or 17 was that you moved from the fixed to the floating exchange rate, and what happened was that the value of the Egyptian pound in comparison to the dollar fell the half, right? So you would need the double amount of the Egyptian pound note to buy dollars. Yes. So that's that discussion, that maybe with the forex market you can control it a little bit more. It's more of a democracy, and maybe it reflects then better the market and the commodities, right? Because as we say, money is just a tool. It's not in itself any product, while gold is a product in itself and can be used for other things. You will never print money, right? Of course, the paper and the machinery costs money to produce the money, but I don't see it as a direct substitute with anything else. Just the central banks may be competing against each other to buy these machines. Maybe that's it. But with gold, it's much broader. Right? You can use gold for, as I said, jewelry, and there's a lot of that. Right? Every person that gets married gets a ring. Some people gets a bathroom made out of gold and things like that inside in the United Arab Emirates, just for fun. So using gold maybe as a middleman, let's call it a middleman or catalyst between the currency and the commodity market, might not seem that smart after all. And we moved away from that. Now I know I've blamed the removal of the golden standard previously for maybe fueling the crisis, but I think it has not. Well, it might have fueled one crisis, but it has made a lot of other crises much better, such as the Great Recession in 2008, and possibly also the crisis that we're living at the moment. And we discussed how money supply, the increased money supply to the supply side of the market might help the help the countries or the world economy stay afloat. I think that's it for the follow-up. Now we go to the reading part, and I've not read anything in my spare time, so it will be directly where we left off yesterday. I hope I can find the exact place, and I have here my notebook and my pen. It's, yeah, I have an arrow where I left off. It's page 160 now. And I'm just going to read one section a little bit above, because those are, we're going to 1 and 2, and I don't really recall what it was about. Okay, so the banking companies of Scotland accordingly were for a long time very careful to require frequent and regular payments from all their customers, and did not care to deal with any person, whatever might be his fortune or credit, who did not make what they called frequent and regular operations with them. By this attention, besides saving almost entirely the extraordinary expense of replenishing their coffers, they gained two other very considerable advantages. That was the idea that if you have a bank account, or you're dealing with an individual, well, then you want the things that he's lending and the things that he's paying back to be kind of zero. So you want a net zero with the customer, right? That's when it becomes profitable for the bank to deal with this particular individual. The discussion was that in England, it was on aggregate zero, but in Scotland it was individually net zero. And now we're going to talk about why it might be better in Scotland. I think if that's not the exact idea, then that is how I understand it. So yes. First, by this attention, they were enabled to make some tolerable judgment concerning the thriving and the declining circumstances of their debtors, without being obliged to look out for any other evidence beside what their own books afforded them. Men being for the most part either regular or irregular in their payment according as their circumstances, are either thriving or declining. A private man who lends out his money to perhaps half a dozen or a dozen of debtors may either by himself or his agents observe and inquire both constantly and carefully into the conduct and situation of each of them. But a banking company which lends money to perhaps 500 different people, and of which the attention is continually occupied by objects of a very different kind, and have no regular information concerning the conduct and circumstances of the greater part of its debtors, beyond what its own books afforded it, requiring frequent and regular payments from all their customers. The banking companies of Scotland had probably this advantage in view. So it's a very interesting idea, right? I'm just gonna write adverse selection. So adverse selection, well, it's not really adverse selection, but more of but that's what it leads to, right? So information asymmetry between banks and their debtors. Yes. Secondly, by this attention, they secured themselves from the possibility of issuing more paper money than what the circulation of the country could easily absorb and employ. When they observed what within moderate periods of time the repayments of a particular customer were, upon most occasions, fully equal to the advances which they had made to him, they might be assured that the paper money which they had advanced to him had not at any time exceeded the quantity of gold and silver which he would otherwise have been obliged to keep by him for answering occasional demands, and that consequently the paper money which they had circulated by his means had not at any time exceeded the quantity of gold and silver which would have circulated in the country had there been no paper money. The, the frequency, regularity, and amount of his repayment would sufficiently demonstrate that the amount of their advances had at no time exceeded that part of his capital which he would otherwise have been obliged to keep by him unemployed and in ready money, for answering occasional demand, that is, for the purpose of keeping the rest of his capital in constant employment. It is this part of his capital only which within moderate periods of time is continually returned to every dealer in the shape of money, whether paper or coin, and continually going from him in the same shape. If the advances of the bank had commonly exceeded that part of his capital, the ordinary amount of his repayments could not, within moderate periods of time, have equaled the ordinary amount of its advances. The stream which by means of his dealings was occasionally running into the coffers of the bank could not have been equal to the stream which by means of the same dealings was continually running out. The advances of the bank paper, by exceeding the quantity of gold and silver, which, had there been no such advances, he would have been obliged to keep by him for answering occasional demands, might soon come to exceed the whole quantity of gold and silver, which, the commerce being supposed the same, would have circulated in the country had there been no paper money, and consequently to exceed the quantity which the circulation of the country could easily absorb and employ. And the excess of this paper money would immediately have returned upon the bank in order to exchange for gold and silver. This second advantage, though equally real, was not perhaps so well understood by all the different banking companies in Scotland at first. So how I understand this section is something like, by understand, not only can the banks make sure that they can get their money back, now they can actually make sure that the country itself is doing well, right? And that they have not produced too much money. And that occurs if they continuously order their customers to pay them partially back. Yes, let's continue. When partly by the conveniency of the discounting bills, and partly by that of the cash account, the credible traders of any country can be dispensed from the necessity of keeping any part of their stock by them unemployed and in ready money for answering occasional demands. They can reasonably expect no further assistance from Hanks and bankers who, when they have gone thus far, cannot consistently with their own interest and safety go farther. I think I think this is something that we don't have in the banks today. I'm not quite sure. Um, but of course the bank can of course choose who to lend to and who not to lend to, but mostly that's because it thinks that those people can pay it back or not pay back. But it's not this second part, which Adam Smith says that people don't understand. And if they don't understand it, then why would they understand it now? Are people much smarter today? Well, you would guess so, but in reality not that much more clever. They are not that much more clever. And how this may relate, right? And this might not be controlled by the banks themselves anymore, but controlled more of the central bank, which is the reserve that the bank has to keep, right? So in periods where you don't need a lot of money in the market, well, then have the money reserve of the banks go up, right? So at this point, they only need 10%, and they can lend the next 90% of the money. Well, this is not what we want this time, right? If we don't need the money in the market, why produce it, right? It might still exist, I don't know. But right now it just seems 10% and that's it. Now, you might also be able to control that with the interest rate, right? So if you're printing out safe money, you would ask for a low interest rate. And if you're printing out money that is not safe, and by safe I mean, well, safe investments, though the safe investments happen in recessions, and that is when there's so that is companies that can always pay back, let's say it like that, right? And at that point you can, for instance, if it's at zero, then, well, then there's really not the interest rate, I mean, then there's really not a lot of need of this money in the market. It's just we need it to be zero, right? They pay, we receive again from the bank's perspective. Um, but in the case where the interest rate goes up, that happens when there are risky business involved, and that's a time where you have a lot of business happening, and the high interest rate might of course reflect the case that this business is a little bit risky. We're not sure that we can get our money back, and therefore we want a higher return on it, but also that we need to produce more money in the market such that that company would be able to pay us back the money, right? Because then you increase the money supply in the market, there those companies can increase the prices, because you think that means inflation, right? Higher interest rate means higher inflation, because otherwise it doesn't work, right? How would they earn this money back, unless they are of course stealing it from people with a lot of money, right? Now, that's an interesting discussion, because, and of course I have to continue reading. What happens in the case with negative interest rates? that means that please use my money. Um, I'm going to write that as a note. Talk about negative interest rates. Okay. And I continue, page 161. A bank cannot consistently, with its own interest, advance to a trader the whole or even the greater part of the circulating capital with which he trades, because though that capital is continually returning to him in the shape of money and going from him in the same shape, yet the whole of the returns is too distant from the whole of the outgoings, and the sum of his repayments cannot equal the sum of his advances within such a moderate period of time as suit the conveniency of a bank. Still less, still less could a bank afford to advance him any considerable part of his fixed capital, of the capital which the undertaker of an iron forge, for example, employs in erecting his forge and melting and smelting houses, his workhouses and warehouses, the dwelling houses of his workmen, etc., of the capital which the undertaker of a mine employs in a sinking his shafts, in erecting engines for drawing out the water, in making roads and wagonways, etc., of the capital which the person who undertakes to improve land employs in clearing, draining, enclosing, manuring, and plowing waste and uncultivated fields, in building farmhouses with all their necessary appendages of stables, granaries, etc. The returns of the fixed capital are in almost all cases much slower than those of the circulating capital, and such expenses, even when laid out with the greatest prudence and judgment, very seldom return to the undertaker till after a period of many years, a period by far too distant to suit the conveniency of a bank. Traders and other undertakers may no doubt with great priority carry on a very considerable part of their projects with borrowed money. In justice to their creditors, however, their own capital ought in this case to to be sufficient to ensure, if I may say so, the capital of those creditors, or to render it extremely improbable that those creditors could incur any loss, even though the success of the project should fall very much short of the expectation of the project. Right? Which goes to show that if you have the golden standard, the economic progress occurs a little bit slow. Yes, even with this precautions, precaution to the money which is borrowed and which it is meant should not be repaid till after a period of several years, ought not to be borrowed of a bank, but ought to be borrowed upon bond or mortgage of such private people as purpose to live upon the interest of their money, without taking the trouble themselves to employ the capital, and who are upon the account willing to lend that capital to such people of good credit as are likely to keep it in several years. Now he's really talking about something as a bond market, as a bond or mortgage market. Tradable. Yeah. A bank indeed which lends the money without the expense of stamp paper or of attorney's fee for drawing bonds and mortgages, and which accepts their repayments upon the easy terms of the banking companies of Scotland, would no doubt be a very convenient creditor to such traders and undertakers. But such traders and undertakers would surely be more convenient debtors to such a bank. Most inconvenient debtors to such a bank. It is now more than 25 years since the paper money issued by the different banking companies of Scotland was fully equal, or rather was somewhat more than fully equal, to what the circulation of the country could easily absorb and employ. Those companies, therefore, had so long ago given all their assistance to the traders and other undertakers of Scotland, which it is possible for banks and bankers consistently with their own interest to give. They had even done somewhat more. They had overtraded a little and had brought upon themselves that loss, or at least that diminish diminish of profit, which in this particular business never fails to attend the smallest degree of overtrading. Those traders and other undertakers having got so much assistance from banks and bankers wish to get still more. The greediness of the banks. The banks, they seem to have thought, could extend their credits to whatever sum might be wanted without incurring any other expense beside that of a few reams of paper. They complained of the contracted views of distardedly spirit of the directors of those banks, which did not, they said, extend their credits in proportion to the extension of the trade of the country, meaning, no doubt, by the extension of the trade, the extension of their own projects beyond what they could carry on, either with their own capital or with what they had credit to borrow of private people in the usual way of bond or mortgage. The banks, they seem to have thought, were in honor bound to supply the deficiency and to provide them with all the capital which they wanted to trade with. The banks, however, were of a different opinion, and upon their refusing to extend their creditors, some of their traders had recourse to an expedient which, for a time, served their purpose, though at a much greater expense, yet as effectually as the utmost extension of the bank credits could have done. This expedient was no other than the well-known shift of drawing and redrawing, the shift to which unfortunate traders have sometimes recourse when they are upon the brink of bankruptcy. The practice of raising money in this manner had been long known in England, And during the course of the late war, when the high profits of trade afforded to a greater temptation to overtrading, is said, maybe overtrading is also a word. Yeah, overtrading. Overtrading is said to have been carried on to a very great extent. It's a very interesting thing to say, overtrading, right? Because is that an overissue? Does he mean an overissuing or an overtrading? Right? Because in today's world, well, the market corrects itself because you can buy and sell, you can short sell, you can long buy and things like that. So the market may correct itself, but I think with overtrading he means overissuing of new money. But I'm not sure. Let's see. Maybe he explains it. It's said to have carried on to a very great extent. From England, it was brought into Scotland, where, in proportion to the very limited commerce and to the very moderate capital of the country, it was soon carried on to a much greater extent than it ever had been in England. The practice of drawing and redrawing is so well known to all men of business that it may perhaps be thought unnecessary to give any account of it. But as this book may come into the hands of many people who are not men of business, and as the effects of this practice upon the banking trade are not perhaps generally understood, even by men of business themselves, I shall endeavor to explain it as distinctly as I can. I need to highlight this part. Because I've studied business for 5 years and I'm not sure what he's talking about. I've studied economics for 5 years and I'm not sure what he's talking about, and this book is over 200 years old. This is not good. It's either me or it is really the system. But maybe he's also talking only about business. No. No, but I like the way that this book is written. Really, really like. I think that's also a part of it. As he says directly, this book is intended for the commoners, right? Well, not the commoners, because at that time not a lot of people could read, and I don't think that he expected this book to be that much of a success that it would still be read by me, an Egyptian living in Denmark, or a 23-year-old Egyptian living in Denmark, and I've studied economics for 5 years at Aarhus University. Yeah, let's see. The customs of merchants, which were, yeah, I'm reading again. The customs of merchants, which were established when the barbarous laws of Europe did not enforce the performance of their contracts, and which during the course of the two last centuries have been adopted into the law of all European nations, have given such extraordinary privilege to bills of exchange that money is more readily advanced upon them than upon any other species of obligation, especially when they are made payable within so short a period as 2 or 3 months after the date. If when the bill becomes due, the acceptor does not pay it as soon as it is presented, he becomes from that moment a bankrupt. Okay. The bill is protested and returns upon the drawer, who, if he does not immediately pay it, becomes likewise a bankrupt. If if okay, maybe it's because this is not necessary for modern days. No, that's what's happening in the bond market, in the equity market, right? Let's see. If before it come to a person who that's the mortgage crisis. That's what happened in 2008, I suppose. If before it come to the person who presented it to the acceptor for payment, it had passed through the hands of several other persons who had successfully advanced to one another of content of it. Another the contents of it, either in money or goods, and who to express that each of them had in his turn received those contents, had all of them in their order endorsed, that is written their names upon the back of the note of the bill, which endorses hmm, in Hmm. Endorser becomes in his turn liable to the owner of the bill of the content, and if he fails to pay, he becomes too from that moment a bankrupt. Though the drawer, acceptor, and endorses the bill, should all of them be persons of doubtful credit, yet still the shortness of the date gives some security to the owner of the bill. It is true. See that. Though all of them may be very likely to become bankrupts, it is a chance if they all become so in so short a time. The House of Cards. The house is crazy, says a weary traveler to himself, and will not stand very long. But it is a chance if it falls tonight, and I will venture therefore to sleep in it tonight. I have to read this out again. The house is crazy, says a weary traveler to himself, and will not stand very long. But it is a chance if it falls tonight, and I will venture therefore to sleep in it tonight. The house is crazy, says a weary traveler to himself, and will not stand very long. But it is a chance if it falls tonight, and I will venture, therefore, to sleep in it tonight. I have to write that down, I'm so sorry. The house is crazy, says a weary traveler to himself, and will not stand very long. But it is a chance if it falls tonight, comma, and I will venture, therefore, to sleep in it tonight. The house is crazy, says a weary traveler to himself, and will not stand very long. But it is a chance if it falls tonight, and I will venture, therefore, I sleep in it tonight. This is crazy. This is. What? And then he goes, okay, listen. The trader A, so he's using the same logic, A and B. Still at this, oh my god. The trader A in Edinburgh, we shall suppose, draws a bill upon B in London, payable 2 months after date. In reality, B in London owes nothing to A in Edinburgh, but he agrees to accept A's bill upon condition that before the term of the payment he shall redraw upon A in Edinburgh for the same sum, together with the interest of the and a commission, another bill, payable likewise 2 months after date. B accordingly, before the expiration of the first 2 months, redraws this bill upon A in Edinburgh, who again, before the expiration of the second 2 months, draws a bill upon B in London, payable likewise 2 months after date, and before the expiration of the third 2 months, B in London redraws upon A in Edinburgh, another bill repayable also 2 months after that date. The practice has sometimes sometimes gone on not only for several months but for several years together. The bill always returns to A in Edinburgh with an accumulated interest and a commission for all the former bills. The interest was 5% in the year, and the commission was never less than 1/2% on each drought. This commission being repeated more than 6 times in the year, whatever month A might rise by this expenditure might necessarily have cost him something more than 8% in the year, and sometimes a greater deal more, when either the price of this commission happened to rise, or when he was obliged to pay compound interest upon the interest and commission of former bills. This practice was called raising money by circulation. In a country where the ordinary profits of stock in the greater part of mercantile projects are supposed to run between 6 and 10%, it must have been a very fortunate speculation of which their returns could not only repay the enormous expense at which the money was thus borrowed for carrying it on, but afford, besides a good surplus, profit to the projector. Many vast and expensive projects, however, were undertaken and for several years carried on, without any other fund to support them besides what was raised at this enormous expense. The projectors, no doubt, had in their golden dreams the most distinct vision of this great profit. Upon their awakening, however, either at the end of their project or when they were no longer able to carry them on, they were seldom, I believe, had the good fortune to find it. The method described in this text was by no means either the most or the most expensive one, in which those adventures sometimes raised money by circulation. I think also raising money by circulation is a note here. So, raising money by circulation. It frequently happened that A in Edinburgh could enable B in London to pay the first bill of exchange by drawing a few days before it became due a second bill at 3 months' date upon the same B in London, the bill being payable to his own order. A sold in Edinburgh at par, and with it content purchased bills upon London payable at sight to the order of B, to whom he sent them by the post. Towards the end of the late war, the exchange between Edinburgh and London was frequently 3% against Edinburgh, and those bills at sight must frequently have cost A that premium. This transaction, therefore, being repeated at least 4 times in the year and being loaded with a commission of at least 0.5% upon each repetition, must at that period have cost A at least 14% in the year. At other times, A would enable to discharge the first bill of exchange by drawing a few days before it became due a second bill at 2 months' date, not upon B, but upon some third person C, for example, in London. This other bill was mailable to the order of B, who, upon its being accepted by C, discounted it with some banker in London, and A enabled C to discharge it by drawing a few days before it became due. A third bill, likewise, at 2 months' date, sometimes upon his first correspondent B, and sometimes upon some fourth or fifth person D or E, for example. This third bill was made payable to the order of C, who, as soon as it was accepted, discounted it in the same manner with some banker in London. Such operations being repeated at least 6 times in the year and being loaded with a commission of at least 0.5% upon each repetition, together with the legal interest of 5%. This method of raising money in the same manner as that described in the text must have cost A something more than 8%. By saving, however, the exchange between Edinburgh and London, it was less expensive than that mentioned in the foregoing part of this note, but then it required an established credit um, with more houses than one in London, an advantage which many of these adventurers could not always find it easy to procure. The bills which A in Edinburgh drew upon B in London, he regularly discounted 2 months before they were due with some bank or banker in Edinburgh, and the bills which B in London redue upon A in Edinburgh, he as regularly discounted either with the Bank of England or with some other banker in London. Whatever was advanced upon such circulating bills was in Edinburgh advanced in the paper of the Scotch Bank, and in London, when they were discounted of the Bank of England, the paper of the bank, in the paper of the bank, though the bills upon which this paper had been advanced were all of them repaid in their turn as soon as they became due, yet the value which